Okay, good morning. It's time to begin our class together. We want to welcome everyone here, those who are here in person and also those who are watching online. We're thankful and welcoming you. Appreciate your presence. We're excited today. We're beginning our spring gospel meeting with Alan Webster. Brother Alan will be teaching the class this hour, and then he'll be speaking the next hour during our worship hour. We will introduce him a little more fully next hour, but just let me mention to you, many of you know Alan. He was here, I think, about 5.5 years ago in our gospel meeting. It was in the fall of the year, and did a tremendous job. We've been looking forward to having him back. Glad that this could be arranged. Maybe Lisa will close those doors because I can hear that noise even all the way up here. Can somebody close the doors? Thank you. One of the things about Alan that I wanted to mention in view of the Bible class today is that he is a teacher, a long-time teacher of God's Word, and he has a lot of experience in teaching. He currently teaches at the Memphis School of Preaching, and also he teaches at the Georgia School of Preaching, and he travels widely and is able to teach at both of those institutions as the needs arise. And I know he does a tremendous job in teaching, so I know you're going to appreciate his teaching here this morning. One quick announcement before we begin our class. We have 2 opportunities yet for those who would like to host Brother Allen for a meal. All of the evening slots are taken, and 2 of the 4 lunch slots are taken. So there are still 2 opportunities to have lunch with Alan while he's here. That would be on Wednesday and Thursday this coming. So if you'd be interested in that, please see me afterwards, and we'll be happy to make those arrangements. Before we study together, would you bow with me in a word of prayer? Father, we thank you so much for this beautiful day, for the night's rest, for the many blessings that you bestow upon us each and every day of our lives. We're thankful, Father, for the congregation here, for the many opportunities that you do lay before us, and now the opportunity of engaging in this gospel meeting together. We're thankful for Brother Allen, for his willingness to come and to spend this time with us this week in this series of meetings. Thankful for his safe journey here. Pray that thou would bless him throughout this day and throughout this week. Bless us as hearers, that we might enter into each session vigorously, receptively, that we might properly understand your word and apply it in our daily lives. Bless him and bless each of us, we pray, in Jesus' name. Amen.
Let's start in Mark chapter 14. Mark chapter 14. So good to be back. There are 37 recorded interactions with Jesus from an individual or a small group. We don't know all the names of the individuals, but these are all recorded for a reason, that is for us to learn. Mark chapter 14 is one of those. This is the Tuesday before Jesus will be arrested, condemned, executed on Thursday night, Friday, and then resurrected on Sunday. So it's the last week of his life. That will be mentioned in the context of this event. He is in the city of Bethany. Bethany was his home away from home. He was from Nazareth. His ministry headquarters were in Capernaum, and both of those are up in Galilee, the northern part of the land. But now he's down in Judea. Bethany is 2 miles south of Jerusalem. It's on the slope of Mount Zion. And during Passover week, which is when this occurs, it was annexed by Jerusalem to be a bedroom, we would call it a bedroom community for those who had traveled to the most popular feast of the Jewish calendar, the Passover, when the city was overrun with guests and there was nowhere to stay. And so Jesus is in the home of Simon the leper. And it's in the hometown of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, his closest friends, as far as I can tell, outside of Peter, James, and John and the apostles. And he spent time in Bethany often. Let's read this, Mark 14, beginning in verse 2. No, let's start in verse 3. Now, let me give you an outline of where we're going in this context. I'll give you two outlines. The first one, if you like alliteration, which is not my cup of tea, but some people find it easier to remember. So you have in verse 3, compassion. Then you have in verses 4 and 5, criticism. And then verses 6 through 9, compliment. But a better outline, at least one I like better. Verse 3 is love. Verses 4 and 5, selfishness. And verses 6 through 9, acceptance, which is Jesus' response to love. Now let's read this beginning in verse 3, and we'll analyze it as we go through. And we'll learn maybe 3 lessons, if we have time, from each section. Let's throw in verse 3, and being in Bethany in the house of Simon the leper. Now, normally you would not go to a leper's house for perhaps obvious reasons, because leprosy is contagious, and lepers diagnosed or recognized as a leper, he would not be able to hug his own wife and kids. He would be in a several house. He would be separated from society. If he were going down the street, he would have to say, unclean, unclean, and people would part like the Red Sea around him because nobody wanted to get leprosy. There was no cure for it. There is no cure for it. They treat the symptoms now, but they still don't cure it. And so here's a man called Simon the leper, but maybe we understand from that, at least from him inviting Jesus and Jesus coming to his house, that he is a former leper. Now, how could you be a former leper? I can only think of one way, and that is that Jesus had earlier encountered this man, and that Jesus had, as he did on other occasions, healed him, and his skin came back as that of a little child. If it was advanced in the stages to where he had lost his earlobes or the end of his nose or his fingers or other body parts which literally would fall off over time with leprosy, then no doubt those were restored and this man received his life back. Maybe that's why Jesus is invited to his house. If Jesus gave your life back, or maybe I should say when Jesus gave your life back, if you're a Christian, then you feel gratitude, joy, want to repay in some small way the tremendous blessings that you had received, we received. So maybe that's why he's in the house of Simon the leper. As he said at meat, in King James, meat just means a meal. Doesn't mean the specific protein meat like we think of. So Jesus is at his house. They're enjoying fellowship at a common meal where Jesus, his apostles are there, Simon's there, Martha's there, Mary's there, Lazarus is there. So it's a pretty big crowd. Maybe others are there. Now, not all of them are mentioned in this context, but this is also recorded in Matthew 26 and in John 12, and we may have occasion to look at both of those in a few minutes. Not recorded by Luke, although Luke records a similar instance in Luke 7, but it's not the same person. Just the lady did the same thing, but it's a different person. Now let's go into the next part of the verse. There came a woman. She's not identified in Matthew or Mark, but she is identified by John. And I'll hold the identification for a moment unless I let it slip. So here we go. There was a woman that came to him having an alabaster box of ointment of spikenard, very precious. John says it was a pound weight, a Roman pound, about 12 ounces in our reckoning. Very precious. It's going to be identified in verse 5 as being worth 300 pence. It doesn't sound like a lot to us. 300 pennies. You may have a jar, a drawer, a box somewhere that has a bunch of loose change, and you might have 300 pennies in there, and if your house caught on fire, that would not be the first thing you went to collect and get to salvage, because pennies aren't worth that much to us. But when you consider that our economy and their economies were different, So Matthew 20 verse 2 says that a man agreed to work manual labor all day for a penny. So that gives us a frame of reference that the common working wage was a penny a day. So 300 pennies would be an annual salary. You take out the weekends. And so this spikenard, sometimes just called nard, an ointment, very aromatic. John says that it filled the house when she breaks the box. Alabaster box, so that's King James. You may have a translation that has flask there. That's probably more descriptive of our concept of what this is. The curious thing about it, though, is that it had no top. It was not something you could open and close. It was enclosed. No doubt that was partly so that it wouldn't evaporate since it was so expensive. And they did not typically use this. They did typically anoint guests who would come to their homes by giving a little dab of oil on the head, often water for the feet. But that would be something much less expensive than this. This would be more of an investment. In those days, they didn't trust banks that much. They had banks, but they didn't trust them so much because Jerusalem was invaded pretty often through the years. You know, it was between the Fertile Crescent and Egypt. Daniel talked and Ezekiel talk about the kings of the north and kings of the south. So Jerusalem was between those two. So whenever one would invade the other, they would go by Jerusalem. And often they'd stop by and invade Jerusalem while they were on the way, you know. And so they learned that, you know, the first place they're going to go is to the bank. And they're going to steal what's there. They also used temples often as banks in those days. And they would even hang things they collected in battle on the outside of the temple. Sometimes you'll see a picture like that and the precious things inside the temple. So that's where they would go to steal things. Well, since you didn't trust the bank, I feel like you're having to look at an awkward position. Someone will move back just a little bit. They didn't trust the bank, so what did they do? Well, sometimes they would bury their valuables. Because in an invading army, after they cleaned out the temples and the banks, they would go to people's houses, and anything they could lay hands on, they would take that. So often if the announcement was made, invasion, then they would go out in the garden or somewhere on property and bury it, and no marker, so that after the invaders went on through, they could go out and dig it back up. But the problem with that is, sometimes you got carried away yourself as a slave, and nobody knew where it was buried and what was buried. And so that's the background of the parable of the treasure hidden in a field in Matthew 13, 44 to 46, where you had a man who found a treasure in the field, and he went and sold all that he had, and he came and he bought the field. And you think, oh, that seems a little shady, doesn't it? I mean, why didn't he tell the guy that, hey, I found treasure on your property? Well, that was illegal in those days because so much had been buried and lost over the years that it was legal not to tell. You know, so they found it, he bought it, and that's an illustration of how valuable the kingdom is. Some people just stumble on it. Somebody may stumble on it this week. You may invite somebody to the gospel meeting who has no intent this morning to come to hear the gospel preached, but because an interaction occurs and they accept an invitation. We had a baptism down in Florida this year. A young lady, low 20s, just drove by the church building on her way to work or school, and she saw the sign, and she thought, I'm going to go check that out, and she did. I texted her this morning. She's a member of the body of Christ now because she stumbled upon the pearl, or the treasure hidden in the field of the pearl of great price. There may be somebody in Martinsburg, West Virginia, that even this morning asked God to help me find a way to heaven. Now, God doesn't answer a sinner's prayer, but does God know that that prayer was prayed? That thought was there? Yes. And you may have prayed, lead me to some soul today. Teach me, Lord, just what to say. You think God might arrange a meeting of those two this week? I don't know what you understand about providence, but I believe that's altogether possible, because that's what God is all about, is saving lost souls. And who's going to save lost souls but His own saved people? That'd be us. Well, that's another sermon. I sort of got off track. But you have them burying treasure, and sometimes they would put it in clothes, like a robe, an embroidered robe. That's the background of Matthew 6:19-21, where it says, "Lay up for yourself treasures on earth, where moth nor rusteth, corrupt thieves break through and steal." Moth corrupt you? I haven't given a second thought to moths all my life. Maybe I had a garment that had a hole in it that might have been, I never thought about it. But they did, because if you put a year's salary into an embroidered robe, which you could run and grab in time of invasion and take with you, and whenever you got to a safe place, you could sell it, turn it into money, and support your family with it. That was the idea. Well, that was a problem for them. You didn't want moths in your expensive retirement, savings in that robe. All right, number 3 was they put it in a flask of ointment. Also portable, so you could take it and go and sell it, and then you could live off the proceeds until you could go back home. So that's what you have here. Now, we'll come back to that thought in a moment, but let's continue. A box of ointment of spikenard, very precious, and she brake the box and poured it on his head. I guess I'll go ahead and introduce John into this. So hold a finger there or put a ribbon there, and let's go to John 12. Now, John is the autoptic gospel, which is in contrast with the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which means, that's not a word we've used over breakfast this morning, synoptic. But what it means is to see from the same view. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke are all similar. They're 80% the same and 20% different. John is 80% different and 20% the same. He's the supplemental gospel. He was written a little later, fills in the gaps for us. So that is the case here. We have the same occurrence that's recorded, but we have a lot of different details that are not recorded elsewhere. So let's begin reading in verse 1, I'm in John 12:1. Then Jesus, 6 days before the Passover, came to Bethany, where Lazarus, which had been dead, whom he had raised from the dead. Now keep that in mind. Lazarus is newly raised from the dead. That was chapter 11. We're in the first verse of the next chapter. Then, or rather there, they made him a supper. They're at Simon's house, and we broached the possibility that perhaps he's there because Simon invited him because of his cleansing, but it may also be that Mary and Martha invited, and Lazarus, invited Jesus to celebrate their brother's life given back to him. And maybe it could even be both. They made him a supper, and Martha served. Now, Martha's always serving. If you want an outline of this, I was looking at this morning, you could put beside the verses or above or in your notes, you can outline this section by the characters. So Martha is verse 2, Mary is verse 3, Judas is verses 4 through 6, Jesus is verse 7 and 8. And Lazarus is verse 9. I went really fast, so I'll do that again. So this is all about the characters. And really, I've never preached it this way, but you could preach a lesson off each of these characters. This is a remarkable text. So you have Martha, verse 2, Mary, verse 3, Judas, 4 through 6, Jesus, 7 and 8, Lazarus, 9. Now, let's go into that section and see some details we don't see in Mark. They made him a supper, and Martha served. Now, that's not unusual for Martha. If you want to do a personality profile of Martha, she would be type A. She's a can-do kind of person. And that got her in trouble in Luke 10, 38-42. You remember, she was in the kitchen. Mary was in there listening to Jesus. And she got upset with her and came in and told Jesus to tell Mary. Why didn't she just tell her herself? But send Mary in there. Make her come help me. I'm working my fingers to the bone in here, and she's sitting in here. Jesus said, I can't do it. She made the better decision. 20 years later, if they still lived in that house, do you think they ever said reminiscently, you remember when Jesus came to our house? You remember he sat right here on this couch? You remember that lesson he taught that day? Mary says. Martha says, I didn't hear that one. Wouldn't that be sad? What an opportunity she had. But we also come down, in my judgment, a little too hard on Martha. Can God use type A personalities? I don't know what you call the other personality, if it's type B or what, but God uses reticent, intellectual people too. Both are needed. Whatever personality type you are, you have to govern it according to the circumstances. God needs leaders, but leaders have to govern themselves to be worshipers, because it's hard to sit still for an hour or 2 hours. I'm thinking about what I'm type A, so think about what I want to do next and where we're going to go. And, you're doing that when you're really supposed to be focusing on God. We'll talk about that tomorrow night. So we have to govern ourselves. But the other personality type that might be more likely to sit and read a book needs to get up and go talk to a neighbor about the gospel, or, go help the sick. Or, so we all have things to work on. Martha here is serving, and that's a good thing. She's in somebody else's house, Simon, I guess a neighbor down the street, but she's serving. That's just who she is. Then Lazarus was at the table with them. They went to his funeral, right? And now he's back. Well, that would be a curiosity, wouldn't it? And that verse 9 says that people came not just to meet Jesus, but also to see Lazarus. I want to see that guy. What did he look like? Any changes? I don't know. Was he better or worse after dying? I guess dying could take a lot out of you, But Jesus could put a lot in you, so I guess he was back at least where he was before. Mary took, here's a spoiler, then took Mary a pound of ointment of spikenard, very costly, and anointed the feet of Jesus. So it's Mary. Now let's ask the question, why? Why? You think it might be that she was happy to have her brother back? I can see Mary. Do you read the Bible with imagination? Do you put yourself there? Do you see it happening? I read somewhere that 65% of people are visual and the rest aren't. So if you're a visual person, I'm visual. I try to see it. So I see Mary. Jesus is coming. Jesus is here. He raised Lazarus. They were disappointed about Jesus not showing up earlier in John 11. He whom thou lovest is sick. They'd sent a message to Jesus. Jesus dallied for 2 more days. He didn't drop everything and come. In the meantime, Lazarus died. He'd been dead 4 days by the time Jesus got there. And both Mary and Martha met him first, then Mary, said the same thing to Jesus. If thou hadst been here, our brother had not died. There's accusation in that. Really wish you'd gotten here in time. Well, Jesus got there in time. They just didn't. They knew he could heal the sick. They didn't know he could raise the dead. So Jesus says, show me where you've laid him. Remove the stone. The Bible's so real. It says, Lord, maybe we shouldn't move that stone. He stinks. Well, that's pretty real. He's been dead 4 days. Decomposition started. Jesus said, move the stone. Lazarus, come forth. Brother Keeble, you say it's a good thing he said Lazarus, or everybody in that cemetery would have got up. One day he's not going to put a name, John 5:28. He's just going to say, come forth. And every cemetery is going to look like a plowed field because everybody's going to come forth, including those that you've been to the cemetery to bury, and yourself if it's after, if Jesus comes later instead of sooner. So Mary goes into her house. I see this. Maybe it didn't happen this way, but she had to get the spikenard, right? So where was it? I guess it was hidden somewhere in her house. Maybe it was buried in a closet under some stuff. And she walks in and she's thinking, I want to give Jesus something. What can I give him? Maybe she thought about something and said, no, that's not enough. And then this, no, that wouldn't be good to give a man. I could give him that spikenard. No, don't do that. That's our family heirloom. That belonged to great-grandmother. She's passed that down, and I couldn't do that. And then she thought, well, why not? What am I ever going to do with it that's better than giving it to Jesus, who gave me my brother back, who gave me my soul salvation, who's my best friend, that I love so much. So she goes back there and she gets it out, maybe dusts it off. And, there are no words here from Mary. I just see her, she probably carried it pretty carefully, something worth that much. She's walking down the street. She goes into Simon's house, and there they are, around the table. Now, we're going to have a fellowship meal today, I think, right? That's the main reason I drove all this way. We're going to sit at tables about waist high, our feet under the table. That's not how they did meals. They had 18-inch tables, short, and they had cushions or pillows around, and they would stretch out, feet away from the table, prop up on an elbow, and eat with the other hand. So when she comes in and she spots Jesus, maybe his head's away from her instead of across the table, I don't know. But she just walks right up. Now, remember we said there was no top on this. You had to break it to open it. So she breaks the alabaster box or flask, had a long neck on it that made it easier to break. And she poured it on his head. I see her tunnel vision here. There's other people there, but she's just got one person in mind. She's just come for that purpose, She just walks right in and just pours it on his head. And I see her step back and look at his face. And then Jesus. Maybe he was talking and then there's stuff running down his face. It's like. And then he looks up and who's there but Mary? Pensive Mary. Love in her eyes, appreciation, kindness, compassion. I don't know how he could have any countenance except a smile there. Thank you, Mary. That was so sweet. Now, those words aren't recorded. But knowing Jesus as we do and knowing the situation, what other response would there be? That's verse 3. Let's see if there's anything else in John before we leave it. So the odor filled the house. Oh, she poured it on his head, Mark says, but John says she poured it on his feet. So Bible critic says, you Christians, you trust that Bible, and it's just riddled with mistakes. You can't even get what part of the body she put the ointment on right. So a contradiction refers to two things that cannot both be true. If there is a plausible alternative interpretation, then it is plausible that there is no contradiction. If there is a probable alternative interpretation, then it's probable that there is no. If there is a reasonable, it's reasonable to believe there's no contradiction. All that's true, philosophically or polemically. So is it possible it happened like this? Mary comes in, we go back in our story a little bit. Mary comes in, breaks it, pours it on his head, steps back. And then oh wait, there's more. I didn't pour it all. You didn't have a lid to put it, so what am I going to do with the rest of it? And then she sees his feet. I said, well, she just pours it on his feet. And then don't know if this is appropriate to say, but I'll say it. You ever been out mowing grass or working in the garden or field? You come in, you got all dusty and sweaty, and you got those rivulets sort of run down, I gotta wash this off. This feels awful. Well, I think that may be how Jesus' feet looked. He walked in, she poured the ointment on, and there was mud then, been dust before mud now, because they walked everywhere, dusty roads. And I see her looking around for a towel. I mean, it's not her house, right? So it's like, oh, I'm in a mess. No towel. So she does something that women would not normally do in that culture. She took down her hair. Now, girls wore their hair down, but women did not, because it was a sign of loose morals. She got down on the floor beside his feet with her hair, wiped the mud from between his toes and onto her hair. Boy, there's a lesson in that. What does 1 Corinthians 11 say that hair is given to a woman for? Her glory. So she laid her glory at Jesus' feet. That's what we all ought to do. And she took, what did he teach about washing feet in John 13? Do you understand what I've done? He asked the disciples. Do what I've done. I've said an example. She saw that. She knew that. She did that. She was doing what others wouldn't want to do. That's love. Well, that brings us to Judas. Let's go. John 12 mentions the name of the disciple that was the ringleader. It's not mentioned in Mark, but it says in verse 4 of John 12, then saith one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, which should betray him. Why was not this ointment sold for 300 pence and given to the poor? This he said, not that he cared for the poor. I hope nobody ever says that about us. Judas didn't care for the poor. He used that as a ruse, an excuse, a smokescreen. So, boy, if she'd have sold that and put it in our money bag, we could have given some of it to a lot of poor people. But that wasn't what he was really thinking. Because this verse says he was a thief and had the bag and bare what was put there. He had sticky fingers. So when people weren't looking, he would take things out of the bag and put it in his pocket. And he thought, boy, I could get a percentage of that 300 pennies. Incidentally, did Jesus know he was doing that? Of course. Why didn't he confront him? You're not supposed to say things you'll know the answer to in a sermon or a class. But I'll tell you my guess. But I do believe that we all need to be Bible students. We need to think for ourselves, right? So I'll pose that question. It's not a salvation question, obviously. But could it be that Judas was prophesied to do something that was important in the scheme of redemption? And Jesus was not going to interrupt that for something less important? Because he was the betrayer, which was a part of this whole process. I don't know that. But at any rate, that's what Judas did. And he's covered it with a smokescreen. Now, before I leave that first point, though, I said I'd give you 3 lessons. Let's just tick these off really fast and go to the next point. Point number 1, Mary expressed love in deeds. It's one thing to sing, oh, how I love Jesus. It's a better thing to show, oh, how I love Jesus. Both of them are necessary. Both of them are good. She showed it. Number 2, she took advantage of the opportunity while she had it. He was in her town for the last time. And she served in the moment. Some people are like all about tomorrow or next year or down the road. I'm going to do this. I'm going to some great thing. Well, maybe that door will open, but what about today? What about the little thing today that I have the opportunity to do? Number 3, Mary risked criticism to do good. The only person who's not criticized is the person who does nothing. But is that the person I want to be? You know, the Lord will criticize me for that. So let me risk criticism. Let me put my reputation on the line for His glory. So who am I? A servant, a tool in the box. Who am I? Someone who wants to turn the spotlight of glory on Him with my deeds. So there are 3 lessons. Let's move to Judas. So we just saw what Judas did. Let's go back to Mark, though, and see the criticism. Mark 14, verse 4. And there were some that had indignation within themselves and said, you know what's inside your heart's going to come out in your words? They had indignation inside, but it didn't take long before they were sharing that, like Judas was sharing it. So I picture Judas saying, yeah, she shouldn't have done that. What do you think about that? That's a waste. Wasn't that a waste? Yeah, I think you're right about that. Boy, why did she do that? So it spread, didn't it? What was this waste of the ointment made? Might have been sold for 300 pence. They murmured against her. So it went from in the heart to in the mouth to against her, in her ears. What lesson did we learn there? 1, criticism often comes against those who love Jesus more than I do. I read somewhere a definition of a fanatic is just that, someone who loves Jesus more than me. You know, why didn't they offer Jesus some ointment or something within their possession? There's an interesting, I've circled in my Bible, you might want to do this. So the word waste in verse 4, I drew a line down to wrought a good work on me. I circled the on me. Notice how Jesus took this. And then my body in verse 8. So she gave it to me. So her gift was not to Judas. It was not for the poor. It was a gift to Jesus. Now the question is Jesus worth it? Is Jesus worth it? It reminds me of Malachi 1:14-16, where they didn't want to go to worship, in Malachi's day. What a weariness it is. Oh, I want to go. I got to go. And God said, am I not a great king? I deserve it. He made no apologies for desiring worship. He's a great God. That's the same thing here. Jesus made no apology. Yeah, you're right. You shouldn't have done. He didn't say that. He compliments her because she's done a good thing. Now, I marked over in Matthew. We won't take time to do it because we don't have much time. But in Matthew's account, this is Matthew 26. This says, uses the word waste in verse 4. That's the same word that's translated perdition in John 17:12 of Judas, son of perdition. You put those two thoughts together, and this is what we come away with. Judas said, you're wasting that ointment. Jesus said, Judas, you wasted your life. But he was wrong about the first statement. It wasn't a waste. Jesus says in verse 8, she anointed my body for the burying. He had been telling them for 6 months they're going to kill me since Caesarea Philippi, Matthew 16. The disciples argued with him, Peter, not so, Lord. The people didn't get it except Mary. Jesus said, they're going to kill me. She said, oh no. Jesus said, they're going to bury me. She said, oh boy. But I'm going to be resurrected the third day. Jesus says, she anointed my body for the burying. Do you know this old saying? Give me my flowers while I live. Have you heard that? You know, you have funerals in here, I assume, and some, I don't know, funeral customs in this part of the country, but in Alabama, the casket would be rolled in and put up here where the Lord's table is. If it's an open casket, people would walk in and pay their respects and talk to them. Flowers up here, you know, people sit to comfort the lost and remember the dead. How much does the person in the casket enjoy the flowers? Can't smell them, can't see them, can't read the note. You know, give me my flowers while I can appreciate them. There's nothing wrong with that. That's good. That's for the family, though. It's not for the deceased, is it? That's what Jesus is saying here. She gave it to me while I could appreciate it. Now, Nicodemus does a similar thing in John 19:39. He buys a bed of spices, 100-pound weight, to go under the body. Nobody criticized him for that. Well, that's for a funeral. Yeah, this was too. Okay, what lessons? So we saw the first one. Second one is negativism spreads. Negativism spreads. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. That's true positively, that's true negatively. You got somebody in the church that's on fire for God, that's talking all the time about what we could do and where we're going and what Jesus is, and boy, that just spreads. It's hard to be lukewarm and indifferent. If you've got somebody in your house that loves the Lord so much, you're going to catch fire from them. You can do it. You can resist it. But you got somebody in the church that's on fire for God, and then it spreads to another. And boy, that's a great thing. But you got somebody in the church that's, you know, well, that preacher's lesson, I think it. Those elders, I just don't know, but we're going downhill in a hurry. Somebody said, well, you know, you got a point. Which one am I? Am I Judas or am I Mary? I get to choose. Now, my personality might be more like, but I need to change it. And I got the ability to do that. And God's not going to say on Judgment Day, well, your personality. He's going to say, why did you say that? Why did you do that? Why did you discourage my people? Why did you take away from my work instead of building it up? All right, we move into our third point. That's compliment. That's what Jesus said. And the lessons are really obvious, but they need to be said. Verse 6. And Jesus said, let her alone. Don't raise your hand. Have you ever been unfairly criticized? Why is that funny? Because you know I know the answer to it. And you know it's true of everybody in here. Right? Okay. Sometimes elders go home. My dad was an elder. I've worked with elders for years. I've never been an elder, but I know about elders. They go home just so dejected because somebody got in their face, you know. They probably didn't understand all that went into the decision because we're not privy to those meetings. Maybe a preacher puts in a lot of work in a sermon. He knows it's going to be a controversial sermon, but it needs to be preached. He gets up and preaches. Somebody got their toes stepped on, and they walk out and they're mad. He preached what God's Word said. He goes home. You as a Christian, you do what's right. You try to help people, and it gets twisted around and you say, why? Now, I said all that just to bring us into the picture, and it got quiet in here, so I think you're in. Here we go. Where's Jesus? What's he doing? You know, the most quoted Old Testament verse of the New Testament is Psalm 110, verse 1, which says that Jesus sat down at the right hand of God. So that's where his normal position is when he went back to heaven. But you know where he is, what position he's in? And our bell's about to ring, but I'm going to keep talking for just a minute. Unless somebody's on the bell, don't ring it. He was standing when Stephen was being stoned. Standing? That seems to me to indicate he was interested. He was concerned. And you know what he said to these disciples about Mary? Leave her alone. You think he ever says that to those that criticize you? I think he does. Leave her alone. She's trying to do right. And you won't hear it, see it, or know it with sensory, through the senses, but just know it by faith. You do right, Jesus is on your side. He loves you. Now, the last thing I'll say is, another lesson from this is, she hath done what she could. Nobody can do more than that, and nobody should do less. And if everybody did that, what a world we would live in. What a church we would be a part of. Thank you for your attention this morning. We'll be dismissed for our break.